the very idea of literacy seems so important and essential to learning. We've talked about how the governor mentioned it in the State of the State. I've always heard from education practitioners that in the early years, kids are learning to read, and then after that, they're reading to learn. And so it's kind of hard to overstate how important it is. And when we're trying to grapple with things like that as a state for essentially how do we boost literacy rates, how do we improve core education metrics, it seems important to look at the entire landscape of school types and education types in the state. And so maybe I want to ask you, as folks in Utah think about how to address this challenge, where are the bright spots? And you, as the practitioner in the charter school world, I think can kind of shed some light on where we're doing well. What do people need to know? What does our audience need to know about how things are actually going in terms of things like literacy rates?
Wow, that's a great question. And I love the bright spots. There are some really remarkable bright spots in the state of Utah. SB 127 has now been in effect for a couple of years. And so we had data from that was released in the fall of 2024 and data that was released in the fall of 2025. So we have 2 years of data to look. And as we looked at the results in 2024, we saw that I believe it was, and I can check for sure, but I'm thinking out of the top 10 schools that scored that year, it was 5 were charter schools, I believe. Or maybe it was 4 the first year and 5 this last year. So we're seeing, that's when you take the schools, not the districts, all the schools in the state of Utah, and you look at their results, about half have been charter schools in the top 10. And then you also can look as districts, which is trickier because charter schools are actually considered districts. And so each little teeny charter school is its own district. So you can look at the scores as far as districts too. And I'm interested in that because the schools that I managed through a contract, I managed about 5,500 students at 7 campuses for American Preparatory Academy. And so we're a pretty large district, meaning we're about halfway in the state size of districts, of traditional district size. And so we're number 4. So in the top 10 districts, all those little charter schools count too, but our district is there at number 4. And so it's cool to look at these numbers and see where the bright spots are. And we have that data now. Maybe that's the best part, is that we have the data now and we can look and see and really start to hone in on the best practices that are working.
And as you mentioned, SB 127, that was a Senate bill from a few years ago, right? Is that what created sort of this data apparatus to give us the numbers you're talking about?
Absolutely, yep. The state was required through that bill to have to set a standard. Well, the standard was set in the bill that schools and districts need to meet 70% of their kids at grade level reading in 3rd grade. And that's what they identified what that would be. They asked the State Board of Education to hone in on exactly what that meant, which they did in rule following that. And now we know what the goal is. And we've had 2 years of data to look at how schools have been doing.
Carolyn, one of the things I want to ask is, those sound like encouraging numbers, obviously, to see some of those rankings with charter schools doing well. Why do you think that is? What is unique about those charters that are doing well, especially when it comes to literacy rates, helping kids read? I mean, my wife and I, we have 2 little boys. They're very young, so they're still a little upstream from some of these kinds of things. But we're with our 4-year-old, we're in the process of teaching him how to read, and he's learning fast and learning a lot. So we're kind of very early on, just as parents, in that experience. But it just anecdotally, it's hard, kind of helping our son learn how to read, just because he's trying to maintain their focus and attention and those kinds of things. So how do you do it? How do you do it well? How do charters do it? I mean, this is one of those core foundational education metrics that are essential for the rest of life as kids grow up. What's kind of the secret, if you will, of why some charters can actually do really well at this?
I'm going to talk about specifically us first, American Prep, because last year when the first scores came out, our Draper 1 campus, which was the school that I opened in 2003, was number 1 in the ranking, which was exciting to me because I came here in 2003 and opened a school using what's called Science of Reading curriculum. That's what SB 127 is all about, is you have to use a certain kind of teaching, which goes back to phonics and things that most parents have heard of. So we know now without any question that the best way to teach reading is to make sure kids learn through phonics how to identify automatically all those sound symbol correlations and do it really well. And so we've been able to kind of emerge from 4 decades of questioning on how we're supposed to teach reading. We're not questioning anymore. We know how to do it. And I came here 23 years ago to bring those programs here. And so it was very exciting for me to see those results come out the first year and show that it was working and be able to show the world that it's working. I've had those results for 23 years at our school. So we now know how. We now have the motivation because the state has told us what we need to do, and we need to use a certain kind of curriculum. And so I think charter schools generally use that kind of curriculum more. They're quicker to do it. When they opened, a lot of them opened because they wanted to use that kind of curriculum. And so they've had more longevity with it. They may have been using it the whole time they've been open like we have. Whereas districts sometimes are just kind of trying to jump in the last few years to really implement these kinds of programs.
Christine, I want to ask you if kind of channeling the parent kind of thing. If I'm a parent who says, well, I want to make sure wherever my kids learn, wherever they go to school, whatever their learning environment is, I want to, if I say, well, I really prioritize literacy, which to a certain extent we all should because it's so important, but thinking through the lens of parents trying to make decisions about how and where their kids' education comes from, which is kind of a key priority of Utah. We've had many discussions with you on this show and with folks from the state, from the governor's administration, that parental choice, kind of parents owning and driving their kids' education is a core Utah principle. And so in that landscape of education choice that sometimes can be a hotly debated topic, Christine, how do you see the idea of education choice and the idea of innovation that comes from that choice fitting into this conversation about things like literacy rates and the kinds of things that charter schools are doing?
I mean, the beauty and benefit of education choice is that you can find these success stories, these bright spots. It's similar in a way when we talk about laboratories of democracy. You can find what works, and you find the success early on. You can kind of share those ideas. Charter schools, because they have the opportunity to innovate, sometimes end up being the leaders and highlighting where the success stories can be. Um, and I think it's good news. We obviously just had National School Choice Week, um, and Utah is doing well in terms of national rankings of having a lot of education choice. Charter schools are certainly a part of that. And I just think that the environment has shifted. I thought there's some really useful polling that the National School Choice Week organization did. They surveyed almost 4,000 parents of school age children, and they found that 75% this year considered looking at other schools. And that's a jump from the year prior, and 60% of parents. But I mean, that in a year is a huge jump. But 75% of parents are saying, let me look at my options. So that's huge. And then, a chunk, I think it was like a little over 20% actually did find a different option for their kids. And amongst that group, a big chunk said they wanted to change because of educational themes or emphasis. And so you can see how literacy could fit into that. A parent might be saying, hey, my child's struggling. Can I go to a school that is succeeding, that's doing really well? So that's exciting. I mean, I think it's even broader. I know, Nick, you and I have discussed a lot about choice, including public choice, education choice. Lots of times we think about it in terms of these private choice programs, but the foundation is really options within the public choice system. And, there's been a lot of news coverage also in Juab School District about Mona Elementary. And they had a gain of 20% increase of students in third grade who are now proficient. And they have highlighted what they've done. I think a lot of it was one-on-one attention to students, a lot of assessing throughout consistently instead of just at the end of term assessment. They brought in parents, had a meeting for them, had videos and things to get them on board, which is huge. So, and that's relevant to this as well because open enrollment, which is where you can also go from one um, public district school to another, requires that we have choices and options and success stories. And so I'm just really excited about that. One thing I will note, the Utah State Board of Education has this tool, the school report cards, and they just um, updated it for the 2024-25 school year, I think. So parents can go on there and look up traditional district schools and charter schools and look at how they're doing in achievement and growth and all the key core subject areas, which is really useful as they're making choices. So I just think choice is going to be part of this discussion, right? As we find what works.
Carolyn, can I ask you, one of the things that I'm curious about is going back to this idea of the science of reading and phonics, maybe colloquially called. Again, so coming from a non-education policy expert perspective, why does it seem a little bit like a new thing? I mean, I remember hearing about phonics, probably doing phonics when I was a kid. You said it kind of was maybe out of style for a while. Can you help our listeners understand just the education policy world, how we kind of went from where we were in the past and now saying, well, no, let's embrace the science of reading. Help us understand that trajectory and why this is an important conversation now for how to improve literacy moving forward.
Well, it's been an important conversation for my whole life. And we have gone through the reading wars of the 80s and 90s, 2000s. No Child Left Behind came in. I want to go back, though, to the 60s, which is when the first science of reading programs were published. DISTAR was published in 1969. You can look at that one. It's kind of cool. And they're still publishing related programs, but they were met with excessive opposition. And as whole language as an idea, and now a failed idea, we know is teaching whole language as a reading strategy is a failed idea. But that was sweeping the nation, coming from both coasts, and mostly the West Coast, however, I will say. In California, they started with whole language in 70s and 80s and 90s. And No Child Left Behind in the early 200s was an initiative by the federal government to try to get people back to science of reading. So I thought we were on the road then to make it happen. And when I got here in 2001 and started using reading mastery among our constellation of reading programs at our school, we have many that we use, but that's one of the central programs that we use. I still found a lot of opposition here in Utah to using that kind of curriculum. As late as last year, after the first results were out, we were told by the State Office of Education they would not approve reading mastery as a new science of reading program in the state. It was troublesome because in the top 10 schools, about 5 of them were using some form of reading mastery. And the data didn't seem to help us. It didn't help us make our case. And they pushed and pushed that we were not going to be able to use our programs. But we pushed back pretty hard as well. And luckily, most of the schools stayed with their programs. Some did jump ship, which made me sad. But there's just, the problem is that but the colleges of education, most of the state colleges of education, don't teach science of reading. They didn't. Now with SB 127, it reached all the way in to the colleges and universities. So now we're going to get that from our teachers, and it'll start to shift even faster. But it's very much a philosophical debate, and that's why homeschool, private school, charter schools kind of always stayed with that more traditional reading program, which now the science has borne out is the best way to teach. And it's going to take some time before our public schools, which receive their teachers from the public universities, can make the switch back into this science of reading curriculum and do it really effectively.
Carolyn, maybe one last question in this segment. We're a little bit over time, but I think that this is an important conversation. What do you see in these kinds of conversations we're having as a state, that we're having as a nation, that maybe are blind spots or things that we need to remember? In other words, what are the kinds of kind of key takeaways from all this, whether someone's a policymaker, an educator, a parent? What's like the one big thing that you wish everyone would just remember so that as we have these kinds of conversations about literacy and the different schooling types moving forward, what's the thing we need to keep top of mind?
The thing is we must do what's best for kids. We always have to look through the lens of what is best for kids, and teaching kids to read fluently and comprehend well is what is best for them. So when the data show us What that is, we have to be willing to put our pride on the side. We have to be willing to do it. And even if it's something we've been taught for years or thought, we have to give up those long-held positions to do what's best for kids.
Christine, we'll give you the last word for this segment. Any key takeaways you would articulate to policymakers, to parents, to educators? I know we'll continue this conversation into the last segment of this episode, but anything on your mind that we're missing that we want to make sure is very clear to our audience about what's important and what's at stake about this literacy conversation we're having as a state right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that we need to keep the main thing, which is educating children. We've already articulated how important reading is. I think it's a positive sign that the legislature and the governor have it top of mind and they want to address it. And I do think, we were talking earlier about data. I know in education, data driven is like a really big term. Let's let it be data driven. I think the beauty about having more data is we can find where it's leading us. And so I'm hopeful that we're landing in the right direction. I mean, as far as the science of reading goes, at this point, it has caught on that this is the direction to go. 40 plus states now have some sort of legislation and this is like since 2019, right? In a short period of time, I think we've sort of understood where we need to go. But so I'm hopeful that our legislature can get it right over time.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.